Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. Patch 11.2 is coming out oh so soon, and we've been able to preview it so far on the PTR, and one of our favorite part about every new patch season is a slew of class changes, and this update has been filled with them. There's so many little adjustments, so many different new gameplay components for just about every single spec out there, but they've also went above and beyond this time around by giving players even more choices when it comes to build crafting. This time, they ended up giving you a choice of which tier set you want to run, as now every class gets 2 tier sets instead of just one. 1 tier set bonus for every single hero spec your class has access to. So for warriors, we're getting a set from Mountain Thane, Slayer, and Colossus that impacts Prot, Fury, and Arms in different ways. And overall, the channel we've been able to cover a number of different class sets so far for the Season 3. However, the warrior sets I think are some of my favorite ones so far. They are simple, but they offer a little bit of self-contained gameplay loops for all 3 hero specs, which to me is extra exciting. With that being said, I do hope warriors do receive a little bit of tuning going forward. This class itself, outside of protection, hasn't gotten a number of changes compared to some of the other playstyles options out there, but at least I'm hoping the warriors are tuned fairly so that they're looking competitive within Season 3, especially when it comes to M+ content, especially that Fury Warrior Mountain Thane set, which looks like a lot of fun. As always, if you guys want to see more regular class guides and updates in preparation for Season 3 content, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So when I take a look at the actual set for the class of the warrior, I don't hate it. I think it's actually kind of a nice set. A lot of players, however, did notice that some of the different recolors are very much like that Legion set from Antorus, which didn't really look that good except for like the Mythic set, but this is essentially, a lot of players pointed, it looks like the Legion Mythic set, but just like a bunch of different recolors of it. And you know, I'm not necessarily going to disagree with you if you feel like that these two sets look very much alike, as there was only 2 variations of the set, like the Elite version, which I can't even preview anymore, but the Mythic set, I mean, it's somewhat similar, definitely spiky. The aesthetic itself, the overall look, the bulkiness and the spikes do somewhat match up. But this one does have some chain physics going on, hair physics for the helm. I love the helicopter thing you can do with it. I like the chains, and I actually like the different recolors of it as well. I think they're generally pretty good. Even like the LFR one, which is the green one, the normal one kind of reminds me of like this classic armor set for warriors. Heroic, I think, also looks pretty good. Mythic, obviously, with C is pink/purple. The gladiator set also looks very good, and the elite model, yeah, I see why some players look at the elite version of this set and like the Legion one and they're like, you know what, it's almost like the same set. I do think it looks really good. However, I don't think the Nightborn look by itself can really give it some justice, because a classic warrior look is the orc warrior because of the massive shoulders, and these look absolutely amazing. You look like a walking human bunker. I'm actually going to play out the rest of the video as an orc warrior, just because I feel like this is how most warriors are going to end up experiencing this new tier set, at least from a visual perspective. Besides the visuals, which I generally did like for the warrior, I know not everybody's going to be a fan of it, but I personally did, but I can see why you may not enjoy them. I do think the tier set bonuses have definitely gotten better, especially the one for Mountain Thane. It went from absolutely atrocious to something that is really fun to play into. They're fairly simple and straightforward, but compared to some of the other class sets, which I have been disappointed with, I like the warrior sets. They are simple, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a little bit of this combo to them, that they basically create even more build opportunities for all 3 hero specs. Starting with the Slayer set, the 2 set reads, execute damage is increased by 10%, and executes from sudden death have a 10% chance per stack of overwhelmed on the target to trigger a Slayer's strike at 100% effectiveness. So this allows executes to feed into Slayer's strikes, which allows you to get more executes onto the target, because the Slayer's dominance ability allows your abilities, random attacks, anything really, to proc a Slayer's strike, dealing physical damage damage, applying Mark for Execution on the target, and eventually it does cause after 3 Slayer strikes to give you a guaranteed sudden death proc. So those executes are able to feed more Slayer's dominance procs, and those Slayer strikes are able to feed more executes, so it ends up working on its own pretty well. It also works off of overwhelming blades, and even executes actually contribute towards overwhelming blades. Every time you execute, you add 2 stacks to overwhelming blades, making it easier for you to maintain the debuff from a blade storm initially, putting out a big damage buff against the target, but then those executes just continue to kind of funnel themselves afterwards. It's a pretty self-contained type of a combo, but after a big old blade storm, you just gotta hope it to fish for a couple of those execute strikes here and there. As long as you're getting a decent bit of procs, which you should be on average, especially as enemies drop to lower health. But this also helps you out at the very beginning, since you're being able to feed more executes, which feeds the rest of the hero spec in general, making it a little bit more fast-paced and a little bit more reactive. But then of course, we also have the 4 set, which further amplifies this combo. The 4 set reads, Overpower damage is now increased by 10%, and Overpower has a 2% chance per stack of Overwhelmed on the target to trigger Reap the Storms at 50% effectiveness. What this does is it allows Reap the Storm, which normally only procs from Cleave on 3 targets, or Mortal Strikes, which has a 20% chance to just proc a AoE ability that deals a bunch of physical damage, applying that Overwhelmed buff against the target, which allows you to deal additional damage to that target. Now overpowers are able to do more damage, so you can actually empower them with things like opportunists so they can deal even more damage, but also they'll proc more AoEs from Reap the Storm, great in AoE, great in Cleave, great in single target, while maintaining that Overwhelming Blades, Overwhelm debuff at all times. It's just a self-feeding playstyle that grants itself more executes, that grants itself more procs of this Blaze Storm through Reap the Storm, because now you can proc it through Overpower as well. So you're basically able to maintain this buff guaranteed 100% of the time in majority of situations, while getting more procs of executes that you can just keep summoning back to back to back at the target. And then you're also just getting more raw damage all across the board. More Slayer strikes, more Reap the Storm procs, and definitely more executes. So in itself, it works out really, really well. And for Arms Warrior, it just ends up being like a big execute type of playstyle, but it allows you to use execute a lot more aggressively, even before the target meets that execute window. For Fury Warrior, the tier set reads, Execute damage is increased by 10%, and executes for sudden death also have a 10% chance to upper stack to trigger Slayer Strike at 100% effectiveness. So for them, it also means more executes. But for Arms Warrior, Execute is more of a builder, or rather a spender for your rage. It doesn't necessarily change the playstyle for them nearly as heavily as it does for Fury. For Fury, Execute is a resource generator. It doesn't spend rage, instead generates it, which allows you to get more rampages and spend your rage a lot more aggressively. And a lot of the playstyle of Fury Warrior is all about spending rage or generating rage as quickly as possible and then spending it as efficiently as you can. So with Executes, it actually becomes an ability that's a lot more usable inside of day-to-day gameplay, and it generates a significant amount of rage that allows you to get more rampages. So it has a more direct playstyle impact on your Fury Warrior, where sometimes you'll just be getting Execute into a rampage, into an execute proc, into a rampage over and over and over. So this improves the quality of life of a Fury Warrior in particular. The feel of the spec actually does go up a significant bit, which is really, really cool to see. So for them, I think it's actually in some sense a little bit more impactful. But then the 4 set reads, Rage and Blow damage is increased by 10%. Rage and Blow has a 2% chance per Overwhelmed, so basically a 20% chance guarantee, to trigger Reap the Storm at 150 effectiveness. This allows another builder of Rage and Blow to now be pushed forward as a priority builder for this build in particular. So any towns that can further amplify the effectiveness of Rage and Blow and promote more uses of Rage and Blow, this could actually make this playstyle just a little bit better. This also helps shift Slayer a little bit from spamming primarily Bloodthirst to potentially spamming more Rage and Blows, because now there's a bit more support for that ability, as it can proc you even more procs of that Slayer. So for them, you just adjust like which button you prioritize, most likely. So for them, it'll likely change the which button you're going to be prioritizing as your core builder, as your priority builder, which changes the feel of the spec slightly. But more executes in general is going to feed you more resources And it to some degree can maybe, to a very small part, bring back that execute godly warrior from Antorus. Is you're slamming more and more executes at the targets back to back, especially when they get low on health. So for a lot of your warriors, this basically just gives them like a very fast-paced playstyle. That's all about big building, big spending very rapidly, and it's really satisfying to play into. While we're still on topic of Fury Warrior, I also want to take a look at Mountain Thane, which is another playstyle that's also fairly popular amongst Fury Warriors in AoE. But the new tier set for Mountain Thane initially came out and it was really just underwhelming, then they changed it and now it looks like it has a lot of potential. Mountain Thane Premier Core playstyle is about using abilities that can trigger lightning. That lightning can deal additional damage, but it can also give you procs of Thunder Blast, which replaces Thunderclap and makes it deal a ton more damage and generate plenty of resources, making Thunderclap an ability you actually use as a priority button for Fury Warriors. Combined together with a lot of these lightning elements about the playstyle, and it really looks good visually, but it also feels good to stomp around. For the most part, Fury Warriors transition into this playstyle because Thunder Blast as an ability deals significant damage in uncapped AoE. Technically, there is a soft cap beyond 5 targets, but it still is better to amplify this ability as like your only button that actually doesn't have a hard cap on cleaving multiple targets. And the tier set basically just makes stomping around even more satisfying. The true set reads, Thunder Blast has a 35% chance to call down 5 ionizing strikes on affected targets, with a 4 set further increasing the damage output of ionizing strikes to be 100% more effective, and when you proc ionizing strikes, you gain a charge of Thunder Blast, and your next Thunder Blast deals 100% additional damage. This means that you're going to be able to get more procs of the Thunderclap ability, or rather Thunder Blast, which allows you to stomp around a lot more aggressively. Thunder Blast ability actually deals significant amounts of AoE damage, and it does become a priority ability that you now want to prioritize. As you can see, it actually often resets the cooldown of itself pretty regularly out of all the different abilities out there. So now you can actually just stomp around a lot more as a Fury Warrior, and that feels super satisfying because it can basically proc itself now. It's a very straightforward playstyle that allows you to get more of this visual flavor out of the ability in particular. All this lightning, all this thunder ringing out in every direction, to me is super satisfying. What also helps out is that Thunder Blast can actually be further amplified through a variety of talents. Thunder Blast by itself can deal a decent bit of damage, but you can also have Thunder Blast call down a lightning strike on the enemy it hits, so you can get more guaranteed lightning strikes in AoE, or you can go with activating Recklessness grants a charge of Thunder Blast, so the faster you can get the cooldown reduction of Recklessness, the more Thunder Blast you can control with your cooldowns. Thunder Blast defensively also has Keep Your Feet on the Ground buff, which passively reduces physical damage you take by 2%, but also Thunder Blast reduces the damage you take by 8% for 5 seconds. So now you can use Thunder Blast since you get it more aggressively. You can now just have yourself an 8% damage reduction that is passively present for a Fury Warrior. For a spec like this, you also already have 10% reduced physical damage while you're in rage, so you're basically just getting another layer of defense that's just passively there, further improving the survivability of the spec. Also, there's a nice little combo where Thunder Blast calls down a Lightning Strike that hits enemy targets. Lightning Strikes have a 50% chance to make your next 2 Bloodthirsts have no cooldown and deal additional damage, and Bloodthirsts have a chance to reset the cooldown of your Thunder Blast, giving you 2 charges, or stacking up to 2 charges. So you actually have this like combo that you can just kind of weave over and over and over, and you can potentially proc even more Lightning Strikes with attacks, which could probably even give you even more of the cycling that can go on forever and ever and ever on this playstyle. With the talent Avatar of the Storm, casting Avatar also grants you 2 guaranteed charges of Thunder Blast and resets the cooldown of Thunderclap. While Avatar is not active, Lightning Strikes have a 10% chance to grant you Avatar for 4 seconds, so potentially you could play into a playstyle where you're getting more procs of Avatar, more Lightning Strikes, really triggered by more Thunder Blast when it comes to AoE. So very similar to Slayer Warrior, it is kind of a self-contained type of a build, but when it comes to flavor, it just allows you to use the ability of Thunderstomp a lot more aggressively, just kind of able to spam it out fairly regularly within numbers of procs that you can continue to get, fishing for even more procs with abilities like Bloodthirst, which can sometimes be reset all on its own, also just stomping around dealing a significant bit of AoE damage. And it's actually super satisfying when you get those double procs where you can just Thunder Blast into another Thunder Blast. So you're just walking around clapping your cheeks the entire time, dealing a lot of damage, generating a ton of resources with the ability of Thunder Blast spiking super high up in terms of your overall damage output. Ionizing strikes themselves also don't deal that bad of damage either, because they do proc off of your Thunder Blast. So the more Thunder Blasts you can get, the more ionizing strikes you can get. The more ionizing strikes you can get, the more Thunder Blast that offers. So it just kind of feeds back into itself in a very straightforward but in a very satisfying way in general. And you can see just the amount of procs that I'm getting a back-to-back Thunder Blast, where I can just chain them one after another after another. It's just hilarious, but also extremely satisfying when it comes to that visual aspect of a Fury Warrior, at least in my opinion. When it comes to the spec of prot, essentially you get basically the same tier set with slightly different values. Thunder Blast is a 35% chance to call down ionizing strikes deal more damage, and guarantee your procs of Thunder Blast, where it deals additional damage. For Prot Warrior, there are some synergies when it comes to the ability of Thunderclap, like it can reset the cooldown of your Shield Slam. Getting more Thunderclaps also does reduce the cooldown of Demoralize and Shout, which is yet another defensive. With the best serve cold, you can actually increase the damage of Thunderclap by 8%, and with abilities like Violent Outburst, which can further amplify Thunderclap's damage by 200%. If you chain a Thunder Blast into it, that can also do additional damage. But for tanks, I usually look at what are these tier sets doing defensively, since it's a tank. Dealing damage is one thing, but you're there to mostly increase your own survivability at the same time. So for them, I really think it just leans into keep your feet on the ground to basically maintain almost a higher uptime, if not maybe near permanent uptime, of Thunder Blast 8% damage reduction, which can stack with the rest of your defensive bonuses. But a huge portion of it will come from Thunderlord as well, just because you're able to get Demoralize and Shout a lot more regularly, can be great in AoE content, but also good in single target content as well. And lastly, we have the hero spec of the Colossus, where majority of the gameplay for Colossus will be to slam the targets with massive demolishes, which not only deal a ton of damage that's up front, but also cause enemies to do less damage to you, take more damage from your abilities. So it kind of is like this big one and all button that ends up being further amplified by their new tier set. Demolish damage is increased by 20%, and critical strike damage of your abilities is increased by 20% on targets affected by Demolish for 10 seconds based on a number of stacks of Colossal Might consumed. You build stacks of Colossal Might just from using basic combat abilities, Mortar Strike or Cleave for arms, Shield Slamming for protection, and then that further increases the effectiveness of your next Demolish, which then causes it to deal additional damage, have the stacks last a little bit longer, all the debuffs last a little bit longer. So it basically just ends up amplifying it, but also gives you critical strike damage components after you use some of your base abilities, which can be pretty massive overall. With the aforesaid, Demolish increases your critical strike chance of your next Mortal Strike by 100%. Mortal Strike crits also increase your rend and deep wounds damage by 80% for 8 seconds. So this allows you to go into a crit heavy playstyle where you're able to further amplify the effectiveness of your bleeds by a significant bit. I think for Arms Warriors, this is where you'll likely go into talents like Skull Splitter, which further increase the effectiveness of your bleeds for 10 seconds, and you'll combine it together likely with the Demolish, or just keep it on cooldown for additional resources plus additional bleed damage to further amplify the effectiveness of your bleeds. This also causes your Colossus to also want to go into a little bit more bleed heavy playstyle with things like Arterial Bleed, and it allows the bleed based gameplay in particular, at least from the abilities mentioned in the tier set, your deep wounds as well as your rend, to be far more effective and consequential portion of your damage. You're still going to have a huge Demolish, but it's the sustained damage afterwards that continues on, which plays heavily around being able to get critical strikes with Mortal Strikes to extend and maintain that bleed debuff against the target for as long as possible. I'm a big fan of the tier set, how it actually gives you a crit damage window in particular, and this can actually synergize with some of the other crit damage components such as Champion's Spear, an ability that by itself doesn't really do too much but can be further amplified with things like Champion's Might. Duration of Champion's Spear is increased by 2 seconds, and you deal 25% increased critical strike damage to targets chained by your spear. So as long as you're able to land that spear, you're further amplifying that critical strike damage component together with the Demolish window, so you can actually do quite a huge bit of damage output inside of that limited space. Where this tier set gets actually very interesting for is when it comes to protection warriors, because I like to look at every single tier set from a defensive point when it comes to tanks. I mean, of course, this is going to do obviously more damage because Demolish is a huge hitter for protection. The critical strike damage amp is also going to be massive overall, but also Demolish is giving you a guaranteed crit chance of your shield slam afterwards by 100%, and any other crit slam from your shield slam is going to also increase your rend and deep wounds damage by 80%. Defensively, Demolish and being able to crit more often does allow shield slam to generate more strikes of Colossal Might. Colossal Might, when it reaches past maximum stacks, is also going to be able to grant you the ability of Demolish faster because of a cooldown reduction that is baked into the playstyle. So when you do use Demolish, you put a debuff on the target where they deal less damage to you, and being able to use Demolish more regularly does mean that you can use this defensive window a lot more regularly as a prop warrior. So there's an obvious defensive component from Demolish as is. However, there's also a bonus healing component because protection warriors don't really have a lot of self-healing. As a warrior, you just don't heal. You're not a blood death knight. You could literally leech health out of enemies. You're not a monk. You're not a veg demon hunter. Although those tanks, part of the defensive is being able to heal, warriors are really good at protecting themselves and reducing damage taken. However, this bleed damage component from the tiers that amping up the rend and bleed and deep wounds damage does actually result in some survivability increases, specifically with talents like Fueled by Violence, where you are now healed for 150% of the damage dealt by deep wounds. So between being able to reduce the damage you take constantly as a protection warrior from mitigation abilities like shield block, as well as offsetting a portion of the damage into an ignore pain potentially, now and combined together with all the other defenses that you have access to, where you could dampen that damage, now you have some passive self-healing components as the spec as well. Now, if you're not familiar with protection warriors, you'll probably think to yourself that crit shouldn't probably be the highest and the best valued stat when it comes to dungeon or raid content. However, a lot of tanks do actually get some value from crit natively, which normally more crit you have, the more parry chance you have, which allows you just to deflect an attack completely before it even connects with you. So there's a defensive component in stacking critical strike. Most players do assume things like mastery usually will have some sort of defensive component. Versatility is a direct defensive component. Haste can sometimes give you more resources for survivability, but for prop warriors, it is actually not a bad stat, at least as is. And with this playstyle, with this tier set, you will likely end up prioritizing critical strikes in the future, just because Fueled by Violence grants you quite a solid bit of healing, which is something warriors normally don't have direct access to, but now they do. So even on face, Colossus does feel more like a very aggressive, very offensive playstyle of prot, and it really is because it does offer you significant damage. There is defensive components baked into it, and the tier set does help protection use those defensive components more regularly. So at the very least, it does offer what a lot of tanks are looking for, a tier set that can further amplify their survivability, that is something that they can control, but also can impact their damage output, which the tier set accomplishes both. But with that being said, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give the video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Also join our Discord community, especially as we draw in closer to 11.2. They're likely to be doing a bunch of class tunings, so if you just want to keep up with that, the community always loves to dive into all the different blue posts over there. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.